Anthony, I wanted to get you on the call today, one, because out of all the people who have written about Szasz, when I read what you've wrote about him, you seem to really understand what he was saying. And, that's kind of unusual when you come across writings on Szasz, is that people often don't they can't quite wrap their minds around what he's trying to say. And I also know that you had a personal relationship with him. And, but before we get into his ideas, I'd like to know what first got you interested in psychology and psychotherapy.
When I was 15, I think it was, 15 or probably more like 16. When I was 16, I started. No, this isn't right. I was interested in psychology long before that. I read Jane Austen, I read Shakespeare when I was 13. I'd read books as long as I could remember, from whenever I could read. So, of course, I was interested in people and in psychology, and how people related. There were various lies told in my family about my own origins and parentage, and I devoted some time to working out these lies, and then because recognizing that they were lies was rather painful, because they were coming from people whom I loved and who I thought loved me, I had to disguise from myself that I realized that they were lies and that I actually knew more or less what the truth was. So this was really quite a complicated operation I had to perform. It's the sort of operation that precisely somebody like Thomas Szasz, but also Jean-Paul Sartre, would understand, because it's perfectly described by Sartre in his concept of mauvaise foi, bad faith. And of course, Szasz also understands it when he is trying to explain so-called mental illness, which he doesn't use the Sartrean term mauvaise foi, but it is pretty much, his thinking is pretty much equivalent. And he was a great admirer of Sartre, even though Sartre was politically at the opposite extreme, pretty much, to Szasz. Szasz was pretty contemptuous of Sartre's communism, his Maoism, his personal life, the lies that Sartre himself told. But nevertheless, Szasz had a great respect for Sartre's refusal to accept the Nobel Prize on principle. He thought that Sartre's book, Saint-Genet, which at the time of writing was probably the most comprehensive attempt by one man to understand another man in the whole of literature. Szasz called that a magnificent book. So in my own personal life, for my very survival, I had to be interested in so-called psychology, and as I say, I investigated my own life, and I investigated through the medium of literature and plays. And then when I was 16, I got onto James Joyce, and I got onto Freud. I bought Freud's interpretation of dreams, and I found this fascinating, but I also became morally corrupted by it, because Freud has this peculiar pseudo-natural scientific approach, in which he tries to reduce everything to natural science, and in particular to his own so-called meta-psychology, he tries to reduce moral positions, moral thinking, to some sort of rather nasty psychological thinking which lies behind it. So to take one example, when Leonardo da Vinci has compassion for caged birds, and he would buy them, and then he would buy them in a cage, and then he would release the birds. And far from admiring this, Freud analyzes this as a sort of rather contemptible streak of sort of feminine weakness, and pacifism was supposed to be a reaction formation against repressed sadism. And this was relevant in my case because, I mean, when I was a teenager, this was the time of, this was after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it was the beginning of the arms race between the West and the Soviet Union. And we really believed that it was highly likely that there would be a thermonuclear war in the very near future. This was no fantasy. This was what most intelligent people thought was quite probable. I was against Britain, for example, getting a nuclear deterrent. And I even went to jail because of protesting about this, and squatting with some colleagues on a rocket site in Norfolk, in England. But all the time I was in jail, I was in anguish because I was doubting what I was doing, because I thought that maybe Freud was right, and that my pacifist inclinations were merely a reaction formation against repressed sadism. So I was really quite confused. But I would argue that it was an intelligent, in a sense, it was totally stupid. But in another sense, it meant I was taking Freud seriously. I thought Freud was a great scientist of the mind, just as Einstein was a great scientist of the natural world. And if Freud said something was so, it was likely to be true. It was another couple of years before I began to really see through what nonsense this was. Now, I sought psychotherapy for myself. Ever since reading The Interpretation of Dreams, I had thought it would be interesting to have personal psychotherapy, psychoanalysis. And I was lucky enough to be able to get it when I was 22. But I didn't realize what a danger, what a swamp I was actually entering. But through great good luck, the analyst I found was one of the two analysts in Britain who called themselves existential analysts. This was Laing and Esterson. My analyst was Esterson. And I mean, he very quickly pointed out to me what nonsense this idea of pacifism being a reaction against repressed sadism was. And I mean, he says obviously it could be, but it didn't have to be. And now a couple of years, no, about 1 year into my analysis with Esterson, I would have been 23. I had been reading, I mean, I mentioned that I'd read Freud at the age of 16. I'd also read some Jung. After I started going to Esterson and learned that he and Laing were existential analysts, I started studying the existential literature. And this was 1962. And in 1958, well, Laing had written his two books, The Divided Self and The Self and Others. They were published in 1960 and 1961. In 1958, a big book called Existence, edited by Rollo May, Henri Ellenberger, and Ernest Angel, had been published, which had a number of important European existential and phenomenological writings in it. This was the real sort of breakthrough of so-called existential thinking in America and to some extent in England. And I got this book, and the sort of showpiece of this book was a case history by the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst, friend of Freud, Ludwig Binswanger. And this book contained two of his case histories, a short one called The Case of Ilse, and a very long and pretentious and complicated one, a famous one called The Case of Ellen West. And I read The Case of Ellen West, and I was puzzled by it because I was reading this simultaneously with Sartre, and Sartre is all about human freedom, about personal choice. There's no such thing as a mental mechanism. I mean, as Laing said, there may be phenomenologically something which feels like a mental mechanism, but this is simply because the person has allowed himself to experience himself in a mechanical way. And so the therapist shouldn't stop there, but should try to question why the person has come to experience himself in such a bizarre way, as to have mental mechanisms. The point is that he should become not a patient with a mechanism, but an agent who is doing pirouettes and complicated maneuvers with his mind in the way that Sartre describes and calls bad faith, mauvaise foi. So I found Binswanger's Case of Ellen West puzzling because although it has very high-flown Heideggerian terminology, which to this day seems to bedazzle people so that they think something very profound is being argued here, I found it puzzling because it seemed to imply a sort of determinism, which was exactly the opposite of what I had been reading in Sartre. And it was also the opposite of the way that Esterson, my own analyst, approached things. I mean, he held me responsible for everything that I did and for everything that I tried to disclaim responsibility for. This was very demanding, but also very refreshing and demystifying. Now, in about, I would guess this was about May 1963, I was in the basement of a bookshop in the Charing Cross Road. Charing Cross Road in London is a road full of second-hand bookshops. And I was in the basement of one of them, very dark, and I came across a book called The Myth of Mental Illness by Thomas Szasz. And I pulled this book out, and I was rather pleasantly surprised that he seemed to be basing himself on the sort of philosophy that I had read before I got involved with this existential stuff. I was interested in mathematics and logic and Russell and Wittgenstein and philosophy of mathematics and so on. And Szasz seemed to come from this tradition. He referred to these philosophers. And I was quite startled that he was actually arguing that a number of the cases which I had read in Freud and so on were not really cases of mental illness at all. that they were to be understood as, he didn't use this language, but in Sartre's language, it would be praxis, or human action, the actions on one's own consciousness. And this was very, it was revelatory. And I felt a bit scared of it, and I wondered whether it was being too glib, too clever. I didn't actually buy the book. I mean, I was fairly short of money at that time, but I stood there, I would say, for a long time. I don't know, it could have been a matter of hours, pretty much read the book through and was fascinated by it. And I felt that I'm going to have to choose between this way of thinking and Binswanger's way of thinking, in the case of Ellen West, which was a bit daunting, because I thought I had sort of adopted the existential way of thinking. But in fact, I was finding really quite significant contradictions between Binswanger and Sartre, and now very, very much the same thing, if not more so, between Binswanger and Szasz. Then I went away, and this book that I'd read in the basement of the shop kind of stayed in the basement of my mind, as it were, for perhaps 9 months. And then 2 books by R.D. Laing and my own analyst, Esterson, came out. The first was called Reason and Violence, a decade of Sartre's philosophy. And the second one, a month later, was called Sanity, Madness and the Family, Families of Schizophrenics. And this was by Laing and, the first one was by Laing and Cooper, and the second one was by Laing and Esterson. And both of these books were, I found, very striking and very demystifying. The Sartre one continued with the sort of liberatory process that I'd been embarked upon through reading Sartre's Being and Nothingness, because Sartre is continuing the idea of individual personal freedom. He now called it praxis, which he distinguished from process, so that then Laing and Esterson tried to apply this language to their study of the family, so that they looked at things which psychiatrists thought of as process, things just sort of happening, just kind of natural events, so that if one young woman in a family became diagnosed as schizophrenic, this was thought of as a sort of an event within nature, rather as if she had got COVID, got the virus, or as if she'd got cancer or something like this, a kind of natural process. But Laing and Esterson wanted to demystify this and try to understand what was going on by looking at the whole family and seeing it as a sort of complex web of people's praxis, the actual individual personal free choices that all the people in the family were making, and with conflicts which they found convenient to reach a pseudo solution to by identifying one person in the family. In the case of the book, it was always a daughter, an adolescent or young woman daughter, to identify her as ill, and then call in the doctors who rubber-stamped this idea that they were ill, and then put the diagnosis of schizophrenia upon them. This I still think, 60 years later, is one of the greatest books of the 20th century, certainly in the field of psychiatry, though I mean, of course, it's not in the field of psychiatry. It's seeing through the field of psychiatry. It's blowing it up, as Tom Szasz said that he would like to do. I mean, Szasz once gave a seminar for me, and he said that his ambition was to be a terrorist, blowing up the whole field of psychiatry. And I don't know whether he ever put that in print and whether he would have been happy for me to be repeating it now, but that's certainly what he said then. That was either 1903 or 2003 or 2007, when he gave wonderful seminars for me. Your question was, how did I get into this field? So I've described. I started from my own questions about my own life and family relationships, and then started reading the literature. And to my great good fortune, quite early on in my investigations, not after a few years of confusion, having been corrupted by Freud, but then I had the great good fortune to encounter Sartre and Szasz and Laing and Esterson, great demystifiers.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I mean, I really appreciated you walking me through that whole story. I had a similar experience when I first picked up Szasz and started reading him. I couldn't quite make heads or tails of what he was saying, because I was so still in the mindset of that man is a natural being, and these things called mental illnesses are happenings, not things that people do. They happen, like cancer or COVID or something like that. But the more I kept coming back to him, the more I just kept thinking that he's making so much sense. And then I just devoured book after book of his, and he's an intellectual terrorist, I guess would be the best way to describe it. He kind of blows up things in your mind that you had previously taken for granted. But at what point did you actually meet him and become acquaintances with him?
The first time I saw him in the flesh, we didn't speak. I saw him. He probably just caught a microsecond's glimpse of me. There was in 1977. He was actually talking at giving a lecture under the auspices of the Scientologists, which of course has led to a lot of nonsense about him, people alleging that he was a Scientologist or agreed with their philosophy or something. Of course he didn't. I'm sure he thought it was a lot of nonsense. He just said he would have taken money from anyone, even psychiatrists. And in fact, he did take money from psychiatrists. And he said nobody ever criticized him for taking money from psychiatrists, but he thought they were far worse people to take money from than Scientologists were. And anyway, he was giving this lecture, which was a very impressive lecture and discussion. Since I've mentioned it, I may as well mention one thing that impressed me the most, I think, in that lecture. There was a well-known British psychiatrist called Anthony Clare, who used to do a program on the BBC, on the radio. I don't think he ever did it on television. It was on the radio, and it was called In the Psychiatrist's Chair. And Clare was one of the people on this panel. Another of the people was Hans Keller, a famous music critic, who also rather fancied himself as a psychoanalyst. No, he became a friend of Szasz. Anthony Clare said in a rather sort of injured voice to Szasz, he said, so what troubles me about you, Professor Szasz, is that you always you don't seem to take account of the fact that there may be another view on the matter. And so Szasz said something like this. Says, I'm very grateful to Dr. Clare for making this very important point of view, because it is indeed the case that on every question that we have considered today or are likely to consider, that there are certainly two views on the matter. And that is why I am giving you one view, mine. I loved that.
Yeah. He's a very witty and funny man, from what I can tell.
Yes, he was extremely humorous. Well, I mean, he was, I mean, by heredity or whatever, he was bound to be doubly humorous. He was Hungarian and he was Jewish, so that implies kind of two helpings of humor. Anyway, that's the first place I saw him, but I didn't talk to him. The first time I spoke to him was by telephone. I phoned him up, actually. I think he was just freely available in the telephone directory for Syracuse, Manlius. And I just phoned him up because I was doing some research. I've investigated various paradigmatic case studies of starting with Freud and then going on to other people, including Binswanger, the psychiatrist I mentioned. I actually investigated historically that dreadful case of Ellen West. But at the time I rang Thomas Szasz, I had been researching Freud's famous Dora case and also his Katharina case, and I was wondering where I could get a grant to support my research. And I phoned him up to ask him about it. And he said he'd got no idea, but he thought he could get me a large advance if I would write a couple of chapters of a book. Well, I'm very bad at writing books, and I'm better at doing seminars. And so I never did this. But anyway, that was the beginning of our relationship. And then over the years, I had one or two exchanges by letter with him. I finally met him, I think it was the early 90s. We met at conferences in London. And we corresponded by email towards the end of the 90s. I mean, I didn't get a computer till near the end of the 90s, but then we started corresponding by email, and our emails became more and more frequent. In the year 2000, I was invited to go to Syracuse for his 80th birthday conference, and I delivered a paper there, and again got to know him a bit better, then got to know him better still as we continued to correspond. Then in 2002, there were some what I thought were rather stupid attacks on him in a journal, Existential Analysis, in London, and I wrote a fairly detailed rebuttal or reply to these criticisms,
Is that The Unreliable Reader? Is that the title of that article?
No, that's a later one. No, that one was called, what was it called? It was called A Poor Model for Students, a Poor Model for Those in Training, or something like that. The subtitle was the important thing, The Case of Thomas Szasz. You know, I mean, they were talking about him as if he was a sort of, a madman, a case. And so that was, that was what I published. I think it was 2003. And I mean, but by this time, Tom and I had been corresponding quite a bit. Yeah, yes. I'm sorry. I can't quite remember the sequence of all this, but I had, by this time I was already doing my inner circle seminars, which I started in 1996. These are seminars, some of them I conduct, and some of them I invite world experts on various subjects, but they're all to do with the demystifying of psychotherapy, psychoanalysis, psychiatry, and so on, and the foundations, the historical and philosophical foundations of psychotherapy, and sort of demystifying mental illness, so-called mental illness, and so on. So they're very much in tune with Szasz, and he liked the sound of my seminars, and he agreed to do a seminar for me in the, I think the first one he did was December 2003, something like that. But around about that time, I actually got an award called the Szasz Award, which was given not by him, but by an institute, I think it's called the Institute for Independent Thought or something like that, in the States. A number of people, it was called the Thomas Szasz Award for contributions to civil liberties. And because some of my writing and my seminars and so on were in defense of civil liberties, because they were demystifying psychiatry. I was given this award, and so I met him again then. But I mean, by then I'd already met him a number of times, and we were already friends. But I would say it's from about the year 2000, really. Probably from the time I went for his 80th birthday conference and celebration. Our relationship grew much deeper, and I mean, I came to think of him as really my best friend. In fact, I mean, I'd never had a man friend with whom I was as close as I was with Tom Szasz, and he seemed to respect me because I didn't want to be a Szazian or disciple. You know, I mean, I was who I was in my own right, and we would argue about a lot of things. I mean, there were things I didn't agree with him about on the fundamental issues of sort of radical faith in freedom, as he put it. Well, the great title of one of his books is Faith in Freedom. That was something that we shared, this absolute holding oneself and other people responsible for what they did. That was something that absolutely united us. Another thing that we were close on may sound rather strange, and other people who were his friends seemed to find it rather incomprehensible. And that is, he called himself an out-and-out atheist, but he had a deep respect for certain sorts of religion that he respected, and he respected the way that my wife and I were serious about Judaism. Well, I mean, we were serious about many religions, but we actually practiced Judaism. I mean, without regarding it as the only possible sort of mythology, as it were, that one could commit to. I think there are many ways, but this was one, and he respected this, and we talked about this. And he had written a book, The Myth of Psychotherapy,
yes.
and in this book, he. I mean, the heart of that book is his argument that psychotherapy, so called, is not a medical discipline at all. It's basically a kind of, it's essentially a religious discipline, but not in the sense of being in the service of any particular religion. But the sort of heart of it, he thought, was he liked the phrase "the cure of souls." I mean, he compared it to he compared what he was doing to what Luther had done, and for the first time he showed some sympathy with Jung. He said, I can't remember whether he actually said it in the book, but he certainly said it somewhere, that he hadn't appreciated previously the importance of Jung, or just what the split between Freud and Jung had really been about. He had previously accepted the conventional account, which was that Freud and Jung split because of differences about the significance of sex in childhood, something like that. But Szasz says that he came to think that the real difference was that Jung saw psychotherapy as a kind of religious enterprise, and that this was the real difference. But I mean, paradoxically, Freud himself came to see it that way. But again, I mean, this word religious can be very confusing, but spiritual, I don't much like the word spiritual, but it's, Freud wrote a whole book, The Question of Lay Analysis, defending Theodor Reich, a non-medical analyst who was being accused of quackery in a trial in America. And so Freud wrote this book in defense of lay analysis, arguing that psychoanalysis was not anything medical, and that a proper institute for training psychoanalysts wouldn't be a medical institute. It would teach anthropology and mythology and religion and history and art and so on. And one could become a psychoanalyst. I think his position was basically that to become a psychoanalyst, one should have done an honest job, an honest trade first. One should have made out, as it were, under fire in the incredibly complex society that we live in. One should be a man of the world, not a Luftmensch. One should know the society in which one lives, have made out in it, and then become do training as a therapist. And the sort of honest trade could be that you had, the first honest trade could be medicine, but that's only one of many. I think Freud would probably think you could have been a carpenter or a gardener, or a historian or a school teacher. He did say he didn't think that, on one occasion he specified that a psychoanalyst need not be a doctor, but should not be a priest. He actually didn't, even though he was arguing it was a kind of religious enterprise, he didn't want paid up priests to be analysts. One of my students once wrote a dissertation arguing against that, because he himself was a priest who was also a psychotherapist, and he argued that it was quite possible. And I have had a number of rabbis actually coming to train as psychotherapists with me, but it can create difficulties if people are married, as it were, to a certain sort of orthodoxy, a certain sort of ideology, as opposed to the sort of general religious feeling that Szasz had in mind. But this was one of the strong things that he and I agreed about, and which some of the other devotees of Szasz found a bit difficult to believe even. For example, a number of them argued with me that Szasz always said that people should always pay for psychotherapy. It should be an honest contract, openly stated. It should be a contract for money. Well, as a matter of fact, he didn't. He early on he did, in, for example, his book, The Ethics of Psychoanalysis, which is an excellent book, though its subtitle is the method of autonomous psychotherapy, if I've remembered it rightly. Anyway, it's certainly, I think that is right. It's the ethics of psychoanalysis, the method of autonomous psychotherapy. And then for the Syracuse edition of it, decades later, he writes a new introduction or new preface, and in it he says, he says that, it says, of course, there can be no such thing as a so-called method of psychotherapy. I mean, I don't know whether he notices that he's contradicting his own subtitle, but anyway, I mean, both of these are sort of valid. I mean, he's sort of giving you a method, but he's also saying, there can be no method. I mean, you have the reader has to sort of reconcile this contradiction as best he can. Obviously, if you follow a sort of technique, you try to copy that, then you're not going to be any good at all. But if you take method in the original Greek sense of meaning sort of along the way or something, he's just pointing a way that you have to work out for yourself. You have to take the way yourself. And it's a very good book. But in that book, he has not yet got to where he had got to in the Myth of Psychotherapy the following decade. And of course, in the Myth of Psychotherapy, he argues that he argues against psychotherapy. I mean, most ferociously against the idea of psychotherapy in the medicalized form that it has taken. This corrupt, decadent, pseudo-medical form that it's taken, in which therapy is understood to mean a mental treatment, medical treatment, and psyche is taken to mean some sort of object called the mind. And of course, Szasz was absolutely dead against psychotherapy in that sense. And I mean, there's one sort of so-called Szaszian elder who writes to me complaining every time I use the word psychotherapy, because he says, Tom always explained to me that there was no such thing as psychotherapy because therapy meant something medical. But the fact is that Szasz was more complex than that. And he did use the term psychotherapy when he chose to, understanding it in a totally non-medical sense. And that's how I use it. I use it to mean therapy in Greek means a certain way of attending, and psyche means the soul. So I've got no objection to calling what I'm doing attending on the soul of the people who come to me. And of course, soul doesn't mean what it has come to mean, some sort of disembodied entity. Soul, or psyche, according to Aristotle, means something like the ground and manner of one's relationship to all that is. So I've got no objection to saying that I work at attending to the ground and relationship of somebody's relation to all that is. That's what I mean by psychotherapy, and that's what Tom meant by psychotherapy. And he was quite happy to use the term sometimes, so that, for example, at a seminar in 2007, somebody asked him right at the beginning, Professor Szasz, you're very much against psychiatry, but I have the impression that you think that psychotherapy can be something worthwhile. And Tom said, "Oh yes, psychotherapy. I think psychotherapy is one of the most worthwhile things in the world." Now, there's any number of people who, if I didn't have that on a recording, would simply say that I was lying or deluded, because they are convinced that Szasz was. I mean, you mentioned at the outset that people have got, wrong ideas about Szasz. Well, one of the wrong ideas, which I've seen in print innumerable times, is that he was against psychotherapy, that he wanted to abolish it. Well, I mean, there was one person who wrote a book in the 1980s. That was Jeffrey Moussaieff Mason. He wrote the book Against Therapy, and he actually ended up saying that we could look forward to the day when psychotherapy would be abolished. And I met it. I had met him before he'd written this book. We were both speaking at a conference somewhere, and I'd become quite friendly with him. And so at another conference, he was talking, and I was in the audience, and I asked him a question there, and so he recognized me and then sort of beckoned me to come up and sort of sit with him, on the platform, so we could carry on talking there. And I then put it to him. You said at the end of your book Against Therapy that we could look forward to the abolition of psychotherapy. And I said, I'm actually a friend of the man who is the chairman of the psychoanalysts of what was Czechoslovakia in the Stalinist time. And he vividly described to me the experience of doing psychoanalysis under Stalinism, in which neither the analyst nor the analysand knew whether the other person was a secret policeman. And so was Mason hoping for to make psychotherapy illegal and to ban and abolish psychoanalysis. I used Szasz as an example then. I said, when Thomas Szasz says that he wants to abolish involuntary psychiatry and the insanity defense, he means exactly what he says. He wants to pass a law making involuntary psychiatry illegal. And this is a quite practicable project, just like making slavery illegal. And in fact, Szasz explicitly compares his proposal to make involuntary psychiatry illegal. He compares it explicitly to the successful legal abolition of slavery. So what do you actually mean when you talk about the abolition of psychotherapy? And all Mason could do was just sort of waffle and say, no. He just hoped it would sort of fade away or something like that. So it was really just waffle. But there are plenty of people write books and just casually say that Szasz wants to abolish psychotherapy. What's nonsense. Szasz spoke to me many times about psychotherapy in a very intimate kind of way. And as a matter of fact, he actually said I was the only person that he could talk to about psychotherapy. And it had something to do with this this sort of deep religious sense, I can only describe it as, that he had about it, even while being an out-and-out atheist, as he quite rightly said. He nevertheless, he had a sort of awe, a kind of divine awe for the possibilities of psychotherapy. He thought this was a wonderful thing that Freud had invented. He was full of contempt for Freud's pseudoscientific theories, but he thought it was a wonderful thing that Freud had pioneered the possibility of two people getting together so that one could simply attend to the soul or the urge to repentance of the other. And Sartre, not Sartre, but Szasz talked quite explicitly about psychotherapy as like the cure of souls, giving people a possibility for repentance. I mean, you won't hear that from many of the Szaszians. I mean, this is one way in which I don't agree with a lot of what is written, even by people who claim to be close to Szasz and to know what he's thinking. This idea of repentance, for example, it's all there in black and white in the book, The Myth of Psychotherapy. So Szasz also talked to in these kind of religious terms. I once said to him that I found his atheism deeply religious, and he said, and he said yes. He said in all seriousness, he said yes. That's how I think of it too. Oh yes, and I didn't finish. I didn't finish what I was saying about how people just take for granted that he was, he thought you should only do psychotherapy for money. I mean, this is one of the things that, of course, people are very indignant about. You know, they think he's walking away from all these poor, starving people, the rejects of society. He only wants to work with rich people who are going to pay him. I mean, this is one of the libels against him by people who simply don't read what he wrote and don't know how he thought. Of course, he wrote again and again, and particularly in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis. If you are doing psychotherapy, in private practice, then of course you're going to charge. And I mean, and unless you're a philanthropist who's going to do it all for nothing, but you're going to charge, and then Szasz says just how important it is to keep the contract and to be quite clear what it is you're selling. And he argued that all the talk about the power of the therapist, the power relation, he thought all of that was nonsense. He thought all the power was with the client. He said the client is hiring you and he can sack you. So who's got the power? It's the client. You've got to prove that you're worth your keep. Simple as that. He wouldn't accept any of this. The usual kind of power dynamics that people talk about, and so he certainly said that if you've got a contract, then you honor it, and you insist on the patient honoring it. So you don't allow him to run up a big bill. If he doesn't pay, she doesn't pay, then you say, sorry, I'll wait until you've got enough money to pay again. And for example, he was deeply critical of Freud, who had a patient, a woman patient, whose husband was being dilatory in sending her money, out of which she would pay Freud. And so Freud sort of magnanimously says that he will lend the woman some money so that she can get by until her husband pays up. And Szasz is extremely critical of Freud for this, and says that it's morally exactly equivalent to the man withholding his sexual services from his wife, and Freud offering his sexual services to make for the husband's sexual services until the husband decides he wants to resume. So Szasz was absolutely clear about this sort of thing, about collusion and games playing. He wanted no nonsense, absolute clarity, absolute straightforwardness about who was responsible for what, who was selling what, and so on. But that's not the end of it. And this is where people find it very difficult to believe me, but I've got it in writing, printed in emails, and I've also got it on sound recording. He thought, he actually wrote to me, since what we're doing in psychotherapy is really being simply human, isn't there something wrong about making a profession of it? And he said, actually, it's a pseudo problem. Our forefathers solved it. The way they solved it was that, first of all, you had an honest trade. You were a teacher, you were a tailor, basket maker, something like that. That's how you made your living. And then in your spare time, you were a rabbi. That's what he said, and that was actually his ideal for psychotherapy, that you shouldn't be paid for it, that it should be a kind of ordinary human kindness, as it were, that you did in your spare time. The first rabbis and priests were not paid; they were not paid professionals, although they came to be supported by their communities, but not always. I mean, they could just be basket makers or whatever, and then they did a bit of spiritual counseling in their spare time. And of course, Freud, Szasz liked very much Freud's description of what psychoanalysis was in the question of lay analysis, because Freud said that psychoanalysis is nothing medical. It's weltliche Seelsorge, which means worldly care of the soul. That's almost identical to Szasz's idea of the cure of souls, but without the sort of religious ideology. Secular pastoral counseling. So Freud and Szasz are at one in that. The only difference is that Freud was inconsistent, and he would slip back into medicalizing and sort of trying to turn it all into natural science and so on. But Freud was quite fierce about the idea that psychoanalysis was not a medical discipline. This was another thing that confirmed him in the idea that America was a gigantic mistake, because the American psychoanalysts insisted that their members should all be doctors. And Freud thought this was completely decadent and completely wrong, that they had completely missed the point, which was that psychoanalysis was non-medical. So in that respect, Freud, you could say, was a Szazian.
I think that Szasz in the Myth of Psychotherapy pointed out a few times where Freud went back and forth on that. When it suited his needs, for example, training his daughter, of course, it wasn't a medical issue. But then in other circumstances, he has quotes from Freud saying, "Oh, of course it's a medical issue." So do you also see that he went back and forth on that?
That's absolutely right. Freud was a great one for having his cake and eating it, and so was Jung. Jung was also contradictory in this respect. Both of them will sort of unblushingly talk about the analyst as the doctor, and the patient, but then on other occasions they will say, the analyst doesn't have to be a doctor. But yeah.
So go ahead.
I was just going to say. So I mean, this is so really what I've been telling you about is Szasz's philosophy of mental illness, which also, of course, implies that he didn't believe in mental health. I'll come back to that perhaps after a bit, but insofar as it is relevant to the practice of so-called psychotherapy. And so I just want to try to make clear that Szasz did believe in psychotherapy very deeply. It was something that, as I say, he was very close to his heart, and he believed in good psychotherapy. Of course, he thought that what most psychotherapists do most of the time is nonsense, but that didn't affect his faith in the possibility of decent, deep, good, wholesome, enlightening so-called psychotherapy. I mean, he tried to coin new terms for it. I mean, he talked about autonomous psychotherapy in the myth of in the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, and in the Myth of Psychotherapy, he coined another term, a iatrologic. But I mean, that seems to me at least as bad as psychotherapy, because iatro means, iatros is a doctor. So, I mean, that looks at least as medical, or if not more medical than the term psychotherapy. I mean, iatro it occurs in the word psychiatry, which means, doctor of the soul. And so how are you improving on the word psychotherapy by calling it a iatrologic? So that's not one of Tom's finer moments, I think. And he himself dropped the idea after having introduced it. I don't think he ever pushed for that word.
Wasn't the subtitle Religion, Rhetoric, and Repression?
That's the Religion, Rhetoric, and Repression is the subtitle of the Myth of Psychotherapy.
And he, when he talks about rhetoric, he talks about it in the style of actually talking and speaking well, rather than some kind of salesman type thing. Is that true?
Oh, yes, nothing to do with being a salesman. It's rhetoric in the deep sense of, I mean, he said, how can one pretend that when two people are speaking together, they are not influencing one another? And rhetoric is the art of influencing other people. So therefore, psychotherapy, pretty much by definition, is a form of rhetoric. Not in the form of fancy words to seduce the other, but sort of deep words, profound words, and a profound way of speaking, which is going to be of benefit to the other. And I mean, this is going back. I mean, this is what Szasz calls noble rhetoric, as opposed to the base rhetoric of seducing people with fancy words. So he saw almost all psychoanalytic theory, psychoanalytic and psychological terms as base rhetoric. They're a way of seducing and corrupting people. But that didn't mean that he didn't believe in any sort of rhetoric. He believed in the noble rhetoric of authentic psychotherapy.
Yeah. Why do you think it's so hard for people to understand Szasz and to wrap their minds around what he was trying to say?
Right. Well, this brings me to, you see, I've hardly mentioned, I've been focusing so far on psychotherapy. But when Tom himself did his first seminar for me, he did 3 seminars, and the very first one was called On Psychotherapy. But the day went on and the day went on, and he scarcely mentioned psychotherapy. And he was talking all about the law and people being locked up and people being excused for crimes who should be locked up or should be punished, and things like this. And it must have been rather disconcerting to people who were expecting to come along and be told, techniques of psychotherapy or tricks of the trade or something. And I mentioned to him in the lunch hour that people would probably be thinking that, and he said, "Oh yeah, but he said I'm doing the groundwork," and so everything that I've been saying to you so far has scarcely been mentioning something which was only very glancingly touched on in the book The Myth of Mental Illness, and that is what Szasz called the Siamese twins of involuntary psychiatry. That's compulsory psychiatry on the one hand, and the insanity defense on the other hand, because a consequence or a justification, a pseudo-justification of the whole concept of mental health and mental illness is to rationalize or to justify those two practices, that is, locking up the innocent and excusing the guilty. Locking up the innocent is compulsory incarceration of people simply on the grounds that they are mentally ill, and excusing the guilty is making the defense that somebody who's committed a crime is not really guilty of it because they were not really responsible, because they were mentally ill. So as Szasz says, these are kind of Siamese twins. They go together, compulsory psychiatry and the insanity defense, both of them based on the myth of mental illness. And this was really possibly I should even have put the argument, Tom's sort of fundamental argument, this way round. Well, this is the way that he came to his thinking. But I've been telling you about the way that I came to my thinking and to my understanding of him. But he doesn't really explain in The Myth of Mental Illness how he came to his position. The way he came to his position was from walks with a woman servant of his family who was a sort of governess, not exactly. She would take him on walks around Budapest and she would point out buildings to him, and big buildings, and he learned that there were places called prisons where people who had committed crimes were locked up, and there were places called hospitals where people weren't locked up. People went there voluntarily to be cured of or helped because they were ill. There was a third sort of big building, which was called a mental hospital, or might even have been called a lunatic asylum. No, I think by that time it was called a mental hospital because the little boy, Thomas, said to his governess, but the places where they lock up the so-called crazy people, they shouldn't really be called hospitals. They too should be called prisons. So I mean, so Szasz was a little bit like Einstein. I mean, Einstein didn't know what, as a child, recognized that he didn't know what everybody else knew. Everybody else knew what space and time were, but he recognized that he didn't know. And to begin with, he thought there was something wrong with him because he didn't understand. But through his not understanding, he came on the theory of relativity and realized that actually the people who thought they knew didn't know that they didn't know. And similarly with Tom, he was like the little boy who saw that the emperor had no clothes. He just had this single, simple insight as a boy that places called mental hospitals were not hospitals, but they were prisons. And out of that came all of his thinking. He never changed his mind about that. He says he never had to unlearn the concept of mental illness because he had never, ever believed in the concept of mental illness. As soon as he encountered it, he thought there's something suspicious, fishy about it. And the more he thought about it, the more he thought he must be right. So his whole work. So go on.
Didn't he also mention that there was a statue of Ignaz Semmelweis who said that you must wash your hands, doctors need to wash their hands, and everyone called him crazy, and he was thrown in a mental hospital and died a few days later, and I believe Semmelweis was Hungarian as well.
Yes, he does say that. Semmelweis was a great hero of his, and he took that as encouragement, that the doctors could be wrong, and that a terribly simple observation might be right. I mean, what could be simpler than noticing that doctors had dirty hands and didn't wash them before they touched women's genitalia?
Yeah.
And so Tom's thought is basically incredibly simple. Just as Einstein's was, the basic perception that he simply didn't really understand space and time, so what I'm saying about psychotherapy, Tom himself might have not been very happy about the way even that I have introduced his thinking to you. Well, sorry, I mean, you know his thinking already, but if other people are going to be hearing this, I've given you the history of how I came to Szasz's thinking, but the order that he preferred to put it in, both in telling his own autobiography and also in the seminar he did for me, as I said, the order he wanted to put it in was first of all, talking about the conditions under which somebody gets locked up, that's basically it, or gets accused of a crime, and what makes somebody guilty of a crime. What are the reasons for which they can be incarcerated? What are the reasons? Yes. How does it come about that they can be incarcerated even if they're not guilty, and how does it come about that they can be let off and not incarcerated even if they are guilty? So these are the primary questions, if you like, from which the incredibly simple basic questions within which all this talk about psychotherapy should be taking place, so that if a psychotherapist is not clear about this, then the psychotherapist may well do what many of them do, and when things get tricky in the psychotherapy, then they call in a psychiatrist, because these are the people who know when people need to be locked up because they're mentally ill. And so the whole of the psychotherapy takes place within this whole ideology of mental illness and mental health. So really the most fundamental questions for Szasz are these terribly simple questions of liberty and freedom and responsibility, and differentiating these questions from questions of health and illness. He's simply pointing out that there's a fundamental confusion between questions of health on the one hand and questions of ethics or law on the other hand. And it's true that traditionally, I mean, if you look up the word ill or the word health in an etymological dictionary, or any good dictionary, you'll find that originally they are sort of ambiguous. I mean, Shakespeare talks about the ills that flesh is heir to. He doesn't actually mean only, I mean, when he says flesh, he doesn't actually only mean the body, I think. He means, the human beings. So ills can be sort of physical illness, or they can be emotional ills or moral ills, or it's both. But when people use the word mental health or mental illness now, they do not mean it in the traditional way. They mean it in a they mean those terms in a way which is hijacking, or which is parasitic on the truly advanced and admirable modern science of medicine. It's a pretense that what Szasz calls problems in living, which are basically ultimately they're questions of how should one live, how does one live. They're ethical and religious and practical problems. They're not medical problems. Medical problems are the usual sort of things we know as medical problems: a broken leg, a fever from a virus, this sort of thing. These are being confused, and the whole language of medical ills and medical health is being applied to so-called moral, ethical, spiritual ills and health. So Szasz's Szasz's whole attack is on the whole system of mental health. And when you say that you have the feeling that many people, I think you're implying that even people who sort of say that they agree with Szasz don't actually understand him. I certainly think this is the case. I think that both his adversaries and most of his advocates don't really understand him. I mean, many so-called mental health professionals will tell you, "Oh yes, Szasz. Well, I haven't read him, of course, but I know that he was. I know he was very important, and I know that he taught people they shouldn't use the word mental illness, and so we mental health professionals, we don't talk about mental illness anymore. We talk about mental disorders, or we talk about mental health issues." And I mean, I heard Obama in a broadcast wondering, he got himself tied into knots because he found that he'd almost got himself to the point of saying mental illness, and he wasn't sure how to get out of it. Because, I mean, saying mental illness is a bit like saying nigger or something like that. I think you may have to edit that out, but I'm not going to edit it out. It's a dirty word. It's offensive, but there's nothing factually wrong with it. I mean, the word simply means black, and similarly, people behave as if mental illness is not to be used, according to Szasz, because it's offensive. It's an offensive term which may upset people or make them feel stigmatized. I mean, it's completely stupid. And so you find Obama saying that mental health. He found that he was about to describe what people in less politically correct times would have called mental illnesses. And so he got as far as the word mental, and he wasn't sure what he was going to say. So he said mental health illnesses. And I can prove that he said it, not because I've got a recording of it, but because the speech of his was actually transcribed and published. And I saw it the other day, and there it is in black and white, mental health illnesses. Yeah, I mean, the whole thing is so absurd. And people, so most of the people who say they agree with Szasz have got no idea what it is they're agreeing with, because the whole point of what Szasz is doing is throwing out the whole concept of mental health and mental illness together as a total mystification and mythology, primitive thinking. He's throwing the whole lot out. He's far more revolutionary and radical than people realize. He's not just saying something politically correct and suggesting a less offensive language. There was a letter in the London Guardian last week. It was very good. It was criticizing the way people were reducing all the emotional, spiritual, social difficulties people were having because of the lockdown, because of the virus. They were sort of blandly talking about all of them as mental health problems. I thought it was very good that this lady was criticizing that, but she ruined her case by beginning it by saying that mental health professionals will be concerned that, etc. So she was validating the whole concept of mental health professionals in the very first sentence, which sort of undermined the rest of her letter. I mean, I just don't believe in mental health professionals. I wrote a short article with the title "Why I'm Not a Health Professional."
Yeah, that article that you wrote was very good, and it's on your website, so I'll link to it in the notes. But basically, you say in there, you're helping people live their lives better, and that may or may not enhance their physical well-being. I mean, if someone wants to be an incredible rock climber, that might be a very dangerous activity, but that might be how they want to live their life the most. Yeah,
absolutely. It's and I actually wrote that article in response to somebody who had attacked me because I had supported somebody else who was a woman who had written something opposing the registration of psychotherapists by something called the Health Professions Council. This was going to be happening in the first decade of the 21st century, and this had gone a long way towards being realized. All the psychotherapy organizations, like I won't name them, but there are a number of psychotherapy and psychoanalytic organizations that were falling over themselves, begging the government to register them, to sort of legalize them. They needed no legalizing. I mean, not in this country. This is a wonderful country where we don't have the Napoleonic Code, which tells you what you can do. We're free to do what we like. We're free to do anything unless it's explicitly forbidden. And so all sorts of things which in some other countries are very difficult, like getting permission for non-medical therapists to practice, simply didn't arise here. For example, when the Freudian refugees from Vienna came here, there was no difficulty about Anna Freud or Melanie Klein practicing psychoanalysis, even though they weren't doctors, for the simple reason that it wasn't forbidden in British law. But on the continent, it's much more difficult because, in order to do something like that, it has to be explicitly permitted by the law before you can do it. I think Freud and Anna Freud and Melanie Klein, when they came here, and Ernest Jones, all the early psychoanalysts, they would have thought it was extremely undignified and unseemly. All the psychotherapists at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, scrambling to beg the government to register them and legitimate them. Horrible, and very extremely undignified. And so there was a small minority of psychotherapists, including myself, who opposed this. And one woman had written something opposing it, and saying why should she, as a psychotherapist, be registered by the Health Professions Council? She said that her position was something like a chaplain in a hospital. And a chaplain wasn't practicing a health profession, and nor was she. And so I wrote something agreeing with her, and in her defense, saying, as you saw, why I'm not a health professional. No, sorry, that's not correct. I wrote a letter in response to her, and in it I said ours is not a health profession. And then somebody wrote back and accused me of splitting body from mind and working against wholeness, because I was saying that psychotherapy was not a health profession. I thought this was a weaselly sort of argument. The argument about wholeness is, I find, a dishonest one, because you can sort of argue almost anything from wholeness. You can say that, if wholeness is the sort of totality of what we do, then why should our physical, why should health be the thing that characterizes it any more than ethics? If wholeness is a sort of unity of medical health and of ethics, why should you characterize it by the medical part of it, so rather than the ethical part? And it seemed to me simply dishonest. And so I was arguing that what I and other psychotherapists do simply is not a health profession. I was just continuing with Freud's position, many decades earlier, in which he had argued the case that psychoanalysis was not a medical profession.
Right. Is it still legal to practice in the UK without a license?
Oh yes, I forgot to tell you the punchline of this. It was very amusing. So most of the psychotherapists were rubbing their hands in glee. Any minute now they were going to be registered, and they could congratulate themselves that they were all state registered. They were registered by the state as psychotherapists. Freud would have thought this was a terrible cop-out, a sellout. And it was coming very close to that. But then in the year 2010, there was an election and a new government. It was actually a coalition government, which had its own problems, not least through the fact that it was, for the first time for long time, it was a coalition. And so they weren't bothered about what psychotherapists were doing, and so they just said that. They said, we've got no interest in registering psychotherapy, and that was that. And so, thank God, therapists are still not state registered. Of course, there are good reasons, I think, why doctors should be, because there is an objective science of medicine, and there are good reasons why there's the Cancer Act, in which it's forbidden to claim that you have a cure for cancer, for example. But I mean, in the field of psychotherapy, there is no equivalent science. But the reason they want to be registered is that they want to pretend that there is an equivalent science. They want to claim the sort of equivalent status to the well-deserved status of medical doctors as serious scientists.
Yeah. I think perhaps Szasz would have even analogized it to that they wanted to, a lot of people, I think, view the state as a god these days, and they view the state as the official religion, and if they can get ordained into that religion, then that will help them out in some way, or they can be brought into the fold of the mainstream religion. Do you think that may have something to do with it?
Absolutely. I mean, when I say that his attitude was religious, of course his attitude was totally against theocracy, and he coined the word pharmacracy to mean the therapeutic state, yes, and it was a kind of religion in the worst sense, a sort of fundamentalist, fanatical religion, and actually a form of terrorism, because it must be terrifying to get locked up as a psychiatric patient.
Yeah. I mean, we've covered so much here, and I appreciate your time. I know it's getting late there in London, so I won't keep you longer than you would like to stay.
Well, it's no problem. It seemed quite short to me, but I mean, you just finish it when you feel when you feel you've had enough.
Oh, well, yeah. Do you think how are Szasz's ideas accepted in the UK versus the US? Do you have any sense of that?
I'm not competent to compare them. All I can tell you is that my impression is that they are hardly really recognized anywhere. I mean, people will, well, insofar as his ideas are recognized at all, they're usually not attributed to him anyway. They're not credited to him. I mean, somebody wrote a paper maybe about 20 years ago with the title "Diagnosis is Not a Disease" or something like that. Well, I mean, that was a straight plagiarism from Thomas Szasz. When I criticized the person in question, I said, but that title was Szasz's title. And his answer was just, well, it's mine as well.
No footnotes to Szasz?
I don't know. No.
Yeah.
And but even when his ideas are plagiarized, they're terribly watered down. I mean, it's very, very rare to find anybody who actually advocates what he was advocating. Do
you think there'll be a time when his ideas are accepted? I mean, he analogized it to slavery, as at the time, no one thought that a black person should be free, but or very few people probably did, but the time eventually came where that happened. Do you think there will be a time when Szasz's ideas are accepted as mainstream?
I'm just not a prophet, and I really don't know. I mean, he and Esterson. I mean, Esterson was probably the closest to his thinking in this country. Esterson and I myself were, and Esterson thought that his ideas might take 300 or 400 years really to be accepted. Szasz said exactly the same thing to me. he was fairly pessimistic about the immediate future. I mean, he thought that psychotherapy was pretty much finished in the United States because, well, first of all, I don't know whether you know, but he himself stopped practicing as a psychotherapist because he was sued because a patient of his had committed suicide. I mean, quite a long time after the patient had actually had stopped having analysis therapy with him. But I think the widow of this patient nevertheless sued Szasz for not having prevented this suicide. And I think the insurers simply recognized Szasz that it would be safer simply to settle, not to contest it in court. And that's what he did. And he just decided the whole thing was getting so ridiculous and hopeless. He stopped practicing psychotherapy from that time on. I think this was sometime in his 70s. And he simply focused on writing his books. I mean, in a sense, good came out of it because he wrote an incredible sort of flowering of books in his last decade between the year 2000 and his death, or basically between 2000 and 2010. He wrote 10 magnificent books. I mean, they're quite a big proportion of his total oeuvre. He wrote 35 books altogether, and 10 of them he wrote between the ages of 80 and 90.
It's incredible.
And they're very succinct, very well-written books.
How do you think he was able to do that? How did he, I mean, what was his process like to keep up that level of productivity?
I don't quite know what the question means. I mean, all I know is I don't know what the process means. I mean, all I know is that he did keep up that. I think. The answer would be that I think that's what he chose to do. He decided that he was free to make the best use he could of what was left to him of life, and that's how he chose to make use of it, and he achieved it.
Yeah. I mean, his writing is so incredibly clear, concise. It really makes you think, and the fact that he was able to do that into his 80s and 90s is just incredible. Was he still emailing with you when he was in his 90s?
Was he what in his 90s?
Was he still able to use email with you when he was in his 90s?
Yeah, we carried on email correspondence up to a few days before he died. His last email, as far as I remember, I think we were exchanging jokes about the anti-Semitic leader of a political party in Hungary who had turned out to be Jewish, or something like that. A lot of our correspondence was really quite, humorous and, I mean, serious but humorous. And I think that was the very last thing. But we were, I mean, we were talking. We were constantly talking, working out theory, if you like, sort of theory in the true sense, which sort of reflecting on practice, reflecting on this whole world, on the ethics of psychiatry and psychotherapy and so on. We would correspond. I mean, sometimes several times a day, and usually probably several times a week. He was a very, very close friend, really, in those last years. And it certainly didn't. It didn't. There was no. I think he did decide that the last book that he wrote would be his last book. I think I remember him saying that he, and his last book was about suicide. And I don't know whether you know that he committed suicide.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think he was probably thinking that. I mean, the last thing he wanted was to carry on and be dependent on anybody else, and so I think he was arranging it. He was planning it. He was timing himself. He was very disciplined. I mean, he would walk an hour a day to keep himself physically fit, and he carried on doing that, as far as I know, pretty much up to the end. And I think he could have gone on for some years more, but he had a fall. He was always, in the last decade when I knew him, he was worried about having a fall because his bones were brittle, and he knew that was dangerous. And he objected very strongly when I booked him a hotel room with a shower and bath in it and didn't have a proper handle that he could hold on to stop himself falling. And then he did have a fall, and he broke his spine incredibly painfully, and he refused to stay in hospital as he was recommended, and he was given some pills, and I think he took all these pills and maybe some other pills. I don't know all the details, but anyway, he just decided he didn't want the indignity of carrying on being dependent on anybody. But fortunately, he had achieved this magnificent body of work, which he had already decided was complete. At least the book, his series of books was complete. He did carry on writing a few articles in his last year or two.
What do you think? What was your most fond memory that you have of Szasz? Do you have something in mind that you would be willing to share?
The most fond memory, or fun?
Yeah.
Fond. It's difficult to choose just one. I mean, there were many occasions when his deep warmth and affection and sort of fundamental decency and sweetness was manifest in a way that people didn't realize just what a decent, loving sort of man he was. Although some of it was evident, really, if you saw him just answering questions after he'd given a lecture or in a seminar. He was very respectful of every question, of every questioner. He would take every question and say, "That's a really good question," and he would kind of relish it, and he would see what could come out of that question. He's, "Thank you very much. Thank you for that question." Fond memories. The first one that came to mind was I stayed with him a number of times in Manlius, where he lived, near Syracuse, where he was the professor emeritus at the university. And the last time I stayed there, we used to go out and get a sort of late breakfast every morning in a place called Dave's Diner. It would be a kind of brunch. We would have 2 meals a day, brunch, and then an evening meal at another restaurant. And Dave's Diner we were very fond of, but this last day, it happened to be full up. And so he drove me to another restaurant, cafe, and we went in, and it wasn't so nice. It didn't have the same character as Dave's Diner, so we were a little bit disappointed. And I don't quite know what started him on this train of thought, but possibly a sort of association of people going on a journey to somewhere where you would be fed, and then having a not very good experience when you got there. Anyway, for whatever reason, I suddenly realized that he was asking me, he said, "What's it all about? You know, what do you think it's all about? What does Judaism think it's all about?" Because he'd been interested in learning about the Jewish religion from me, because he really had a very conventional sort of assimilated Jew, quasi-Christian sort of knowledge, superficial knowledge and prejudices, in fact, about Judaism. And he said, so what's the Jewish attitude on what it's all about? And he explained why he was asking. He said that, when you think about some of the things that go on in the universe, it could lead to a very bleak picture of things. And the example he gave was of animals which crossed the desert in Africa, I think. They would walk, they would trek hundreds of miles, I think he said, to get to a watering hole. And when they got there, they were eaten by the predators that had been patiently waiting for them to come. And so his question was, what is this all about? What's that all for? And specifically, what is the Jewish take on that? So I sort of mumbled something about, I said, well, I suppose the traditional Jewish idea is that God made human beings in God's image with the idea that they should collaborate with him in the sort of creation and improvement of the world. And the way that they were supposed to do that was by leading a decent life and loving their neighbors and loving strangers. And he sort of looked up and he looked around, and then the most enchanting smile came onto his face. And he said, "It's been quite a successful experiment, don't you think?" And the people he was looking at, I had been feeling very turned off by. I mean, they were very obese, almost like a parody of sort of gross, obese Americans stuffing themselves and their families with what we call chips over here. I don't think it means the same as chips in the States.
French fries.
French fries, yeah, French fries, and whipped cream, and so it's pretty disgusting. They're all sort of stuffing themselves, and but Tom looked around, and and I had been saying this about what it was all about was leading a decent life and loving your neighbors and loving strangers, and so I had been looking, actually with some sort of hostility at these, I thought rather sort of vulgar strangers. I wasn't loving them, but he looked around in this loving way, and he obviously saw that he sort of seemed to be seeing to the heart of them and seeing that beyond all this superficial stuffing themselves, they were basically decent people, and that they would have loved their neighbors. They would have opened the door to a stranger. He somehow, I could just see him from his smile thinking that, and he confirmed it by saying it's been quite a successful experiment, don't you think? So that his original sort of gloom when he was asking about these creatures had turned into a sort of vision that that the world was basically good. It was a bit like when God created the world, and he looked at everything and he saw it was good. It struck me rather like that. Tom was thinking, basically, the world is a good place and people are basically good at heart, and this was the last day I saw him. A few hours later, I flew back to England and I never saw him again. So that was a very happy last memory, or almost last memory.
Yeah. Well, I sure appreciate you sharing that with me, and I would have loved to meet him, but I didn't learn about Szasz until after he died. But
well, I'm sorry you didn't. Sorry you didn't. But he was what we call a mensch. He was a real human being. With with his faults. I mean, and his books contain mistakes and sloppinesses and simple errors. His books are not perfect, but they're pretty good.
Well, Anthony, I sure appreciate you taking the time tonight to talk with me and come on this call. And I'd be more than happy to have you back anytime to talk about Szasz and his ideas. But we're coming up on 2 hours, so I think we'll end it here. And
Sure.
I'll let you know when this comes out, and I'll put in some show notes and release it to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. You're always welcome to come back for more if you want to.
Excellent. Well, take care. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me. Bye-bye.
Bye.